Mist curls over a river at dawn. From its banks rises a silhouette carved in stone, a medieval bridge, its arches reflected in the water like portals to another age. To a traveler of the Middle Ages, this was no mere crossing. It was a lifeline, a promise, a symbol of human ingenuity standing defiantly against the forces of nature. Merchants led their carts across it, peasants trudged with baskets of grain, knights rode proudly with banners fluttering in the wind, each footstep, hoofbeat, and wheel etched into its stones the story of a world in motion. The medieval stone bridge was far more than architecture. It was the thread binding kingdoms together, the artery through which trade, faith, and war flowed. Without bridges, rivers divided lands, isolating villages, strangling commerce, and slowing armies. With them, Europe's fractured landscape became connected. A bridge was both practical and symbolic. It spoke of prosperity, order, and permanence in a time when famine, plague, and war constantly reminded men of life's fragility. To build a bridge of stone was to defy time itself. Wooden bridges, flimsy and fleeting, crumbled in storms or burned in fire. But stone promised endurance. Once raised, it could withstand centuries of floods, winters, and wars. Some even outlasted the kingdoms that built them. A medieval bridge was not just infrastructure. It was a monument, an unspoken declaration that here civilization had planted its roots and would not be washed away. For villagers, the bridge became part of the rhythm of daily life. At its edges, markets sprang up, with traders hawking cloth, fish, or spices to travelers. Pilgrims paused to pray at shrines built into the bridge's towers, asking for safe passage. Beggars waited at its gates, knowing that every soul, rich or poor, had to pass by. Children played along its parapets, watching barges slip beneath its arches. The bridge was not only stone, it was life itself, condensed into a single structure. Yet bridges also carried a sense of the sacred. To cross a river was to overcome a natural boundary, an act that in the medieval imagination bordered on the miraculous. Many bridges bore chapels at their centers, as if to remind travelers that each crossing was both physical and spiritual. Priests blessed them, monks raised them, and legends often surrounded their construction. Tales of devils bargaining for souls, of saints striking the earth to make stones rise. Bridges, in their grandeur, seemed closer to heaven than to earth. And of course, they were places of power. Whoever controlled the bridge controlled the flow of wealth and armies. Kings taxed them, lords fought over them, and soldiers defended them with their lives. A bridge could mean the difference between victory and defeat, between famine and plenty. To destroy one was to sever a kingdom's lifeline. To hold one was to command the land itself. Even today, as we stand before the moss-covered arches of a medieval bridge, we feel its weight. Not only the literal weight of stone, but the weight of history. Each block tells of hands that shaped it, of lives that crossed it, of centuries that passed it by. It is a silent witness, reminding us that in the Middle Ages, survival and greatness alike depended on such feats of engineering. Thus begins our journey into the story of medieval stone bridges, not as cold structures of rock, but as living arteries of an age. They bore the weight of kings and beggars, armies and pilgrims, and they still stand, whispering across time of the genius and faith that built them. Long before the Middle Ages carved its bridges into stone and memory, another empire had already set the foundation: Rome. The Romans were master builders, engineers whose arches and aqueducts still rise against the sky after 2 millennia. Their bridges, forged of stone and bound with mortar, spanned mighty rivers like the Tiber, the Rhone, and the Danube, carrying legions and trade across lands that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. When Rome fell, its empire fractured, but the stones it left behind continued to teach. Medieval builders, though living in what many called a dark age, inherited not only Rome's ruins, but its genius. The Roman arch became the beating heart of medieval bridge design. A simple yet profound invention, it transformed the impossible into the inevitable. By redirecting the crushing weight of stone into outward thrust, the arch allowed spans of remarkable length and strength. The keystone, the final wedge-shaped block set at the top, locked the arch into place. Once fitted, gravity itself became the bridge's ally, ensuring that the structure grew stronger the more weight it bore. Medieval masons marveled at this principle, often studying Roman remains as if they were divine revelations. Yet imitation was never enough. Medieval Europe was not Rome. It was a patchwork of kingdoms, monasteries, and villages, each with different needs and resources. Where Rome built grand, uniform highways of empire, medieval builders adapted. They used local stone, shaped by hand with painstaking labor, and employed wooden scaffolds rising like skeletons from riverbeds. They did not merely copy the Romans, they transformed the old designs into new expressions suited to their fractured yet vibrant world. Roman ruins often served as both quarry and classroom. A half-collapsed bridge over a river might provide ready-cut stone for a new one, and its remaining arches offered a living diagram of forces and geometry. In this way, medieval engineers were like apprentices to a vanished master, piecing together knowledge from broken forms. To them, the past was not dead, but alive, whispering secrets from weathered stones that had outlasted empires. Faith also played its part in this inheritance. Romans had dedicated their bridges to emperors and gods. Medieval builders consecrated theirs to saints and Christ. Where Roman bridges bore inscriptions of imperial might, medieval ones were crowned with chapels and crucifixes. The sacred replaced the secular, but the stones were the same. In both eras, the bridge was more than a structure. It was a statement of power, faith, and permanence. The continuity between Roman and medieval engineering is clearest in the survival of certain bridges. The Ponte Sant'Angelo in Rome, built under Emperor Hadrian, was still in use during the Middle Ages, and pilgrims crossing it scarcely knew where Rome ended and Christendom began. Similarly, in southern France, Roman bridges became the spine of trade routes, repurposed by medieval merchants and pilgrims. For centuries, the line between Roman engineering and medieval ingenuity blurred, one flowing into the other like rivers beneath their arches. Still, medieval bridges bore a character uniquely their own. They were not vast imperial highways, but lifelines for towns and abbeys, scaled to local life, yet no less ambitious. Where Rome built to unify an empire, medieval Europe built to survive, to connect fragmented communities across rivers that threatened isolation. Their bridges, smaller perhaps, but no less enduring, carried the weight not of legions, but of pilgrims with scallop shells, peasants with baskets of rye, and knights bound for crusade. Thus, the Middle Ages began its own chapter in the story of bridges, standing on Roman shoulders, yet walking its own path. From the ashes of empire rose new arches, not imperial but communal, not for conquest but for survival and faith. And in this blend of inheritance and innovation lay the genius of medieval engineering. To take what was ancient, adapt it, and let it live anew. At the heart of every medieval stone bridge lies a simple yet miraculous shape: the arch. To the eye, it is elegant, a curve of stone rising gracefully above the water. To the builder, it was a triumph over gravity itself. And to the people who crossed it, it was nothing short of magic. A path held aloft by invisible forces, a promise that stone could float in the air without falling. The arch was not just a feature, it was the soul of the bridge, the secret that allowed medieval Europe to span rivers and endure the centuries. The brilliance of the arch lay in its humility. Each stone, by itself, was fragile, vulnerable to the pull of the river or the crush of weight above. But fitted together, carved wedge-shaped and pressed side by side, they transformed weakness into strength. At the center stood the keystone, the last stone set, the crown of the arch. With its placement, the structure came alive, forces balanced, and weight distributed down through the piers into the earth. The bridge was no longer a pile of rock. It was a living unity, each stone leaning on its neighbor, all holding each other in eternal embrace. This principle, inherited from Rome but perfected in the Middle Ages, gave bridges their endurance. Floods could rage, armies could march, centuries could pass, and still the arches stood, their geometry unbroken. Where wood rotted and iron rusted, stone arches endured, not because they resisted weight, but because they embraced it, channeling every burden into strength. In a world where so much seemed fragile, harvests, peace, life itself, the arch became a metaphor for resilience, for survival through balance. The construction of an arch was an act of faith as much as engineering. Builders first raised wooden scaffolds and frames, shaping them into the curve that the stones would one day follow. Upon these skeletons they placed stone after stone, each cut with care, until at last the keystone was lowered into place. In that moment, the bridge was born. The wood beneath could be removed, and the stones would hold themselves forever. Witnesses to such moments spoke of awe, as though watching alchemy or a miracle. The transformation of lifeless blocks into a structure that seemed to defy nature itself. For medieval society, arches were more than structural devices. They were symbols. Churches and cathedrals bore pointed arches reaching toward heaven. Castles stood on arched gates, and bridges carried people across rivers of peril. Everywhere, the arch reminded men of order, of harmony, of divine geometry woven into stone. It was said that God himself had written the arch into creation, and that masons merely revealed it through their craft. Some bridges became legendary for their arches. The Puente de San Martín in Toledo stretched its grand span across the Tagus, a daring feat that seemed impossible until the arch held. In France, the Pont Valentré became known not only for its arches, but for the devilish legends tied to their perfection. Each story reflected the awe that people felt, the sense that arches were not only human inventions, but touched by something greater. Even the smallest bridges carried this spirit. A single arch over a village stream could become the lifeline of a community, linking fields to markets, homes to churches. Travelers blessed the keystone as they passed, as if acknowledging the invisible bond that held the stones and their lives together. In times of flood, when waters licked at the piers and roared beneath, villagers prayed not only to saints but to the arch itself, trusting that its form would endure. Thus, the arch was more than the soul of stone bridges. It was the soul of medieval engineering itself. It stood as proof that in an age of uncertainty, there existed a kind of permanence, a shape that could carry the weight of time. Every arch was both an achievement and a prayer, carved into stone, lifted over water, enduring still as a silent hymn to human faith and ingenuity. Beneath the grandeur of medieval stone bridges lay a story not of kings or saints, but of hands, rough, calloused, blistered hands that shaped raw earth into enduring monuments. The stones may seem eternal, but each was once hewn from a quarry, lifted by sweat, and set into place with aching muscles and human will. If arches were the soul of bridges, then labor was their heartbeat, and materials their lifeblood. The choice of stone was the first and most critical decision. Builders sought limestone for its malleability, granite for its hardness, or sandstone for its abundance. Each block was quarried with hammers and chisels, carved into precise shapes to fit the curvature of arches or the bulk of piers. Quarry sites often lay miles away, and so the stones traveled, hauled on wooden carts, dragged by oxen, floated down rivers on rafts. Every journey carried risk: floods, broken wheels, or ambushes by bandits. To move stone was itself an act of conquest. Mortar, too, was indispensable. Made of lime, sand, and water, it bound the stones together like flesh between bones. Mixing lime was dangerous work, the powder biting into skin and lungs, but the result was a substance that, once hardened, could last centuries. Medieval masons understood that mortar was not merely glue, it was alchemy, transforming separate stones into one living structure. In its silent grip lay the secret to permanence. Wood, though absent from the final structure, played a crucial role. Scaffolds rose from riverbeds like skeletal giants, holding temporary shapes upon which arches were born. These wooden frameworks, called centering, were the invisible wombs of bridges. Without them, the first stones would collapse into the river. With them, builders could dare to create impossible spans. Once the keystone was set, the wood was removed, often burned for fuel, leaving behind only the stone skeleton it had helped deliver. The laborers themselves came from many walks of life. Master masons, with knowledge passed down in guilds and secrets whispered like sacred rites, guided the works. Their apprentices learned by carving lesser stones, their skills growing one strike at a time. Unskilled peasants, pressed into service, carried buckets of mortar, hauled timber, or shifted stones. Each man, whether trained craftsman or weary serf, became a part of the bridge's creation, his sweat mixing invisibly with the mortar. Building was perilous. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds dangled from crude cranes of rope and wheel, threatening to crush those below. Scaffolds swayed in the wind, and one false step could mean drowning in the river. Injuries were common, death not rare. Yet the promise of wages, or the hope of spiritual merit if the bridge was built under church patronage, kept the workers at their task. To build a bridge was to gamble with one's life for the sake of future generations. And yet, amid hardship, there was pride. Masons carved their marks into stones, symbols known only to their guild, leaving behind signatures that still whisper across centuries. Workers told stories of their toil to children, who pointed to the rising arches with awe. Villagers gathered to watch milestones of construction, cheering as scaffolds gave way to arches that seemed to float. In these moments, labor became not just survival, but legacy. When the final stone was laid, when the centering was struck and the arch held, the workers' triumph was both humble and eternal. They might never see the distant lands the bridge connected, nor the armies and pilgrims it carried, but they knew they had given something to the future. Their materials, stone, wood, mortar, had been ordinary. Their labor, sweat, fear, endurance, was mortal. But together, they had created something greater than themselves, something that would stand long after their names were forgotten. Thus, each medieval stone bridge is both monument and memorial. Its materials whisper of earth and fire, its form speaks of genius, and its very existence is a testament to countless men whose hands built eternity out of stone. In the Middle Ages, a bridge was more than stone, mortar, and labor. It was a holy act. To span a river was to perform a miracle, and to build a bridge was to participate in divine work. For medieval Christians, rivers symbolized obstacles, boundaries, even dangers of the soul. To cross safely from one side to the other was a metaphor for salvation itself. And so, bridge building was wrapped in faith, seen not only as engineering, but as an offering to God. Monasteries often led the charge. Monks, with their knowledge of scripture and sometimes of geometry, saw bridges as acts of mercy. They built them along pilgrimage routes, where weary travelers marched toward shrines in Compostela, Canterbury, or Rome. To give pilgrims safe passage across rivers was to aid them in their holy quest, a work of charity as precious as almsgiving or feeding the hungry. In the quiet records of abbeys, we find accounts of bridges raised in the name of saints, their arches consecrated with prayers. The Church itself encouraged this sacred duty. Papal decrees sometimes granted indulgences, remissions of sin, for those who funded or labored on bridge construction. To donate to a bridge was to invest not only in stone, but in one's eternal soul. This belief fueled the formation of special groups, sometimes called brotherhoods of bridge builders. Their mission was not war or wealth, but the salvation of travelers. In France, the Frères Pontifes gained fame for their devotion, constructing bridges across perilous rivers so that all, rich or poor, could cross safely. Legends blossomed around these holy works. Many bridges carried chapels at their centers, where travelers paused to pray. On the Pont d'Avignon, a tiny chapel to Saint Benezet stood as a reminder of the boy shepherd who, according to legend, was called by God to build a bridge across the Rhône. Locals mocked him at first, but when he lifted a massive stone single-handedly, they declared it a miracle. The bridge rose, consecrated not by kings, but by faith. Stories like these reminded medieval people that bridge building was not only possible, it was sanctified. For communities, contributing to a bridge became a shared spiritual act. Villagers carried stones, wealthy patrons gave coin, clergy blessed the rising arches. Each person believed their labor or gift tied them closer to heaven. In an age haunted by plague and war, where salvation was a daily concern, the bridge was a beacon of hope, an earthly crossing that mirrored the eternal one they prayed to achieve after death. Yet faith and fear often intertwined. Where bridges seemed impossible, stories of bargains with the devil emerged. Tales tell of masons who, unable to complete an arch, sold their souls in exchange for infernal help. Always, the trickster devil demanded the soul of the first to cross, only to be cheated when a dog or goat was driven across instead. These legends reveal both the awe and the terror people felt. Bridge building seemed beyond human skill, something that must involve forces beyond the mortal realm. In their religious role, bridges were also spaces of ritual. Priests blessed them at completion, sprinkling holy water upon keystones. Pilgrims kissed carved crosses embedded in their parapets. Festivals sometimes marked their opening, blending sacred joy with communal pride. To cross a new bridge was to walk not only over water, but over the boundary between the dangerous past and the hopeful future. Thus, in the medieval imagination, every bridge was more than a structure. It was a sacred crossing, a link not only between two shores, but between heaven and earth. To build one was to gain merit before God. To cross one was to walk within His grace. And as the centuries passed, these sacred arches remained, holy monuments of stone, whispering prayers over the rivers they tamed. If faith gave bridges their soul, commerce gave them their lifeblood. In the Middle Ages, rivers were both barriers and veins of prosperity. To cross them safely meant not only survival, but opportunity. A stone bridge did more than connect two shores. It connected markets, kingdoms, and entire economies. Where a bridge stood, trade followed. Where trade flourished, towns were born. Merchants depended on bridges like arteries of stone. A caravan of cloth from Flanders, wine from Bordeaux, or spices from Venice could not afford delays at fords or ferries. A sturdy bridge meant goods arrived faster, safer, and in greater volume. As a result, bridges became magnets for trade routes, bending the paths of commerce to their arches. To own or control a bridge was to hold a toll gate on prosperity itself. Lords, kings, and bishops understood this well, and they guarded bridges as jealously as castles. The tolls, called pontage, became a cornerstone of medieval finance. Travelers paid in coin, sometimes in goods, to cross. These fees funded repairs, lined the coffers of rulers, and even financed wars. Some tolls were seasonal, others permanent, and many were justified as charitable contributions to maintain the bridge for the common good. Yet for merchants, the toll was simply the price of survival. Better to pay than risk losing wares to the river's fury. Bridges thus became both liberators and gatekeepers, offering safe passage but demanding their due. Markets grew in the shadow of bridges. A town might spring up at either end, its streets swelling with inns, shops, and stalls. Pilgrims stopped to rest, merchants traded, peasants brought produce from surrounding fields. Soon, the bridge was no longer a solitary structure. It was the heart of a bustling economy. London Bridge itself became a thriving neighborhood, its arches lined with shops, its roadway crowded with vendors. To cross it was to walk through a living market suspended above the Thames. For peasants, too, bridges were transformative. A farmer with a cart of grain could reach a distant town market instead of selling only to his village. Fishermen could bring catches inland. Shepherds could sell wool beyond their parish. Every stone arch widened horizons, pulling the rural into the urban, binding isolated lives into a greater economic web. Bridges were the unsung engines of mobility, breaking the chains of geography. Yet commerce also reshaped the bridges themselves. Towers and gates were built not only for defense, but for administration, where tolls were collected and goods inspected. Guards stood at entrances, keeping order and ensuring that trade flowed only with payment. In this way, the bridge became a stage for the drama of economy, where wealth changed hands under the watchful eye of stone walls. The prosperity of a bridge could determine the fate of a town. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London owed much of their growth to the bridges that spanned their rivers, turning local markets into continental hubs. A single crossing could elevate a village into a thriving center of commerce, while its destruction could plunge it back into obscurity. The bridge, in its stone permanence, was an anchor for prosperity as much as for faith. Thus, bridges were not only sacred structures, but economic engines, monuments of both devotion and ambition. They turned rivers from obstacles into opportunities, transforming geography into wealth. Every toll paid, every cart rolled across, every market borne beside an arch carried the same message: that stone bridges were not merely crossings, but lifelines of the medieval world, bearing on their backs the weight of an entire economy. A medieval bridge was never just stone over water. It was a battlefield waiting to happen. To control a bridge was to command the flow of armies, supplies, and wealth. In an age when rivers divided kingdoms and dictated strategies, the bridge became as crucial as the sword. Whoever held the bridge held the key to victory. Warfare in the Middle Ages was often defined by crossings. Armies marching to campaign needed safe passage over rivers, and a single bridge could decide whether they advanced or fell back. To burn or collapse a bridge was to cripple an enemy, stranding his troops and starving his supply lines. To fortify and hold one was to choke the life out of a foe. Bridges thus became prizes, contested with as much ferocity as castles. Some battles were fought upon their very stones. The Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297 is perhaps the most famous. The English attempted to cross the narrow span, only to be ambushed by William Wallace and his Scots. Trapped by the river on either side, the English were slaughtered in their hundreds. Here, the bridge wasn't merely a setting, it was the weapon, the trap that turned the tide of war. Because of their strategic importance, many medieval bridges were built as fortresses in their own right. Towers rose at either end, fitted with gates and portcullises. Arched spans were designed with choke points, allowing defenders to hold back entire armies with only a handful of men. Merchants and pilgrims might pass freely in times of peace, but when war came, the same arches became barriers of stone and steel. Bridges stood as both gateways and guardians. Some were even designed with intentional weak points. A section of flooring could be removed to prevent enemy passage, or a central span could be collapsed under attack. Engineers built with both commerce and combat in mind, balancing the needs of peace and the inevitability of war. A bridge had to serve as highway and fortress, lifeline and weapon. For common people, war transformed the meaning of bridges. The same crossing that carried their goods to market might suddenly be barred, garrisoned by soldiers, or destroyed by retreating armies. Villagers often watched helplessly as their bridges, symbols of prosperity, became the epicenters of bloodshed. Yet they also understood. Bridges were too powerful, too strategic, ever to be ignored in times of conflict. Chroniclers often described bridges as prizes of conquest. Kings celebrated not only the capture of towns and castles, but also of bridges. To take a bridge was to claim dominance over an entire region, for it meant seizing control of roads, trade, and armies alike. Even treaties sometimes specified the handing over of bridges, as if they were living entities with their own sovereignty. And yet, despite the flames of war, many bridges endured. Their stones bore scars from siege engines, their arches blackened by fire, but still they stood, silent witnesses to the fury they had hosted. For centuries, they bore not only the weight of carts and travelers, but the clash of swords, the march of armies, and the cries of the fallen. In the story of medieval warfare, the stone bridge was not passive architecture, but an active participant, a character in its own right. It was the ground on which nations bled and empires shifted. To control a bridge was to wield power. To lose it was to invite ruin. And through it all, the bridges endured, their arches carrying not only commerce and faith, but the memory of war carved deep into their stones. Not all medieval bridges were alike. Some became legends, their arches etched into history, their stones wrapped in myth. They were more than crossings. They were icons, remembered as marvels of engineering, stages of human drama, and vessels of stories whispered through centuries. To step onto one of these bridges was to walk into a tapestry woven of faith, fear, and wonder. In France, the Pont Valentré at Cahors rose above the Lot River, like something from a tale of sorcery. Built in the 14th century, its 6 arches were crowned by 3 imposing towers. Locals believed its perfection could not have been the work of men alone. Legends claimed the master builder, desperate to finish, struck a bargain with the devil himself. The devil agreed to complete the bridge, but when tricked, he exacted revenge by plucking out a stone from the central tower each night. Even today, a carved imp clings to the bridge's masonry, a reminder that in medieval minds, bridges were so extraordinary they seemed to border on the supernatural. In Spain, the Puente de San Martín in Toledo astonished all who saw it. Stretching across the Tagus River with a daring central arch nearly 40 meters wide, it seemed impossible for its time. The story goes that when the builder realized a mistake threatened to collapse the bridge, His wife saved his honor and life by secretly setting fire to the scaffolding before completion. The disaster forced a rebuild, correcting the flaw. Thus, the bridge became not only an engineering marvel, but also a monument to human courage and loyalty. England's London Bridge was more than a crossing. It was a city unto itself. Built in stone in the 12th century, its 19 arches carried not just travelers, but entire rows of houses and shops. Merchants sold wares along its roadway, priests rang bells in its chapels, and kings paraded across its span. Yet it was also a place of grim spectacle. Traitors' heads, spiked and rotting, adorned its southern gate, grim warnings to all who entered the city. To cross London Bridge was to encounter the full spectrum of medieval life: commerce, piety, and death. Elsewhere, bridges became shrines to saints. In Avignon, the Pont Saint-Benazet bore the name of a shepherd boy said to be divinely inspired to build it. When skeptics laughed, the boy carried a massive stone on his shoulders as proof of his heavenly mandate. The bridge became a pilgrimage site, and even when floods destroyed much of it, its surviving arches carried the weight of legend as much as of travelers. Each of these bridges revealed a truth about the medieval imagination, that great works of stone could not be explained by skill alone. They had to be touched by the divine, or tainted by the infernal. For common people, who could scarcely dream of lifting such stones, bridges became miracles in themselves. Their stories passed from generation to generation, blending history and folklore into something eternal. But legend was not confined to myth. These bridges also became symbols of civic pride. Cities carved their identities into the stone, and to lose a bridge was to lose face. To this day, their arches stand not only as physical links, but as emblems of endurance. The imp on the Pont Valentre, the vast span of Toledo, the crowded shops of London, the miracle of Avignon, they are reminders that the medieval bridge was never merely practical. It was cultural, spiritual, and deeply human. When travelers crossed these legendary bridges, they carried more than goods across a river. They carried stories, fears, and hopes. Each step echoed with history. Each glance at the arches reminded them that human hands, guided by faith or tempted by demons, could create something that outlived them all. To the medieval traveler, a stone bridge was not only a passage, but a destination. Its arches were not merely supports of commerce or war. They were living spaces, stages of daily life where entire communities converged. In towns and cities across Europe, bridges became vibrant centers of human activity, part marketplace, part meeting ground, part theater of society. Merchants often claimed the bridge as their marketplace. On smaller crossings, stalls lined the approaches, where bakers sold loaves, fishmongers hawked their catch, and cloth merchants spread bolts of fabric in the open air. On great spans like London Bridge, shops were built directly onto the structure, transforming it into a suspended street bustling with life. Travelers crossing the river found themselves immersed in noise, scents, and colors, the cries of vendors, the smell of roasting meat, the gleam of coin changing hands. A bridge was no longer just a link between banks, but the beating heart of trade. Bridges also became places of ritual and worship. Chapels rose upon their piers, where pilgrims and merchants alike paused to give thanks for safe passage. Bells rang from tiny sanctuaries perched above the rushing waters, reminding all who crossed that their journey was as spiritual as it was physical. Candles flickered in niches along parapets, lit by those who remembered the drowned or prayed for the living. In this way, bridges became sacred thresholds, spaces where the earthly and the divine met. For the community, bridges were gathering grounds. Festivals spilled onto their stones. Musicians played, dancers spun, Jugglers performed for coins tossed into their caps. Nobles paraded across them during processions, while peasants gathered at their edges to witness spectacle. At times, bridges were stages of grief, funerals pausing upon them, coffins blessed before being carried onward. Life and death both crossed the same arches, weaving the human story into their fabric. Yet bridges could also be grim places. Justice was often made visible upon them. Gallows sometimes rose near their entrances, where criminals swung as warnings to all who passed. Heads of traitors adorned gates on bridges like London's, silent guardians of royal authority. The same structure that bore pilgrims and traitors also bore the weight of punishment, binding society together not only through faith and trade, but through fear. Still, for ordinary people, bridges offered simple joys. Children skipped stones from their parapets, watching ripples spread across the water. Lovers lingered at twilight, whispering promises above the current. Farmers paused with their carts to gaze at the reflections of arches shimmering in the river. To live near a bridge was to live near life's crossroads, where countless stories intertwined. Even the poorest found hope in their stones. Beggars positioned themselves at entrances, knowing that every soul, noble or peasant, must pass. Many bridges had niches carved into their towers where alms boxes were set, encouraging travelers to give charity. Thus, bridges became not only engines of economy, but conduits of compassion, where generosity was practiced daily. In the collective memory of a town, the bridge stood at the center. Fires might burn markets, plagues might empty streets, but the bridge endured, drawing people back when the storms had passed. It was permanence amid change, the one place where every life intersected. Through laughter and sorrow, trade and prayer, justice and mercy, the bridge became more than stone. It became the soul of the community itself. Across the rivers of Europe, stone arches still rise against the sky. Weathered, moss-covered, their stones worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, they remain as witnesses to an age long gone. These bridges are not ruins, they are survivors, living monuments to the ingenuity, labor, and faith of the Middle Ages. Though kingdoms have fallen, wars raged, and cities transformed, the bridges endure, their silent strength carrying humanity across both water and time. Each bridge tells a story. It speaks of masons who carved stone with aching arms, of pilgrims whispering prayers as they crossed, of merchants hauling wares that would enrich entire towns. Its arches echo with the clash of swords from battles fought upon its span, with the laughter of children peering into the waters below, with the chants of priests blessing its stones. To walk across such a bridge today is to feel the weight of history beneath your feet, the pulse of lives long past still vibrating through its structure. The endurance of these bridges is not accidental. They embody principles of design so perfect, so balanced, that time itself seems powerless against them. The arch, the keystone, the careful choice of stone and mortar, all combine to create not only durability, but beauty. They remind us that the medieval world, often remembered for darkness and hardship, was also an age of brilliance, capable of crafting marvels that outlasted their makers. Yet their legacy goes beyond engineering. These bridges symbolize connection between lands, between people, between eras. They turned rivers from barriers into pathways, transforming isolation into exchange. They carried the weight of armies and the hopes of pilgrims, the burdens of peasants and the pride of kings. Each arch was a promise that humanity could overcome division, that stone could defy water, that effort and faith together could achieve permanence. Even their legends are part of their legacy. Tales of devils cheated, saints guiding construction, or miraculous feats of strength cling to their stones as firmly as the mortar itself. These stories, half history, half myth, reveal the awe medieval people felt for such works. For them, bridges were not simply built, they were born, infused with spirit, mystery, and meaning. That aura endures, drawing modern visitors who sense, even without knowing, that these places are more than rock. Today, tourists pause for photographs. Cars rumble across lanes where once ox carts rolled, and rivers that once threatened communities are tamed. Yet the bridges remain steadfast, continuing to serve. They remind us of the resilience of those who came before, of their ability to shape a hostile world into one more navigable, more connected, more human. The legacy of medieval stone bridges lies not only in their survival, but in what they teach us. They whisper that strength is found not in resisting weight, but in distributing it, not in standing alone, but in leaning upon neighbors, as stones do in an arch. They show that faith and labor together can create works that last beyond lifetimes. And they remind us that connection between people, places, and times is humanity's greatest triumph. So when you stand before an ancient bridge, its arches mirrored in the water, pause. Listen to the murmur of the river beneath, to the silence of the stones above. In that moment you stand where countless feet once walked, where faith met skill, where the Middle Ages reached across centuries to touch you. The bridge is not merely a relic. It is a voice, speaking still, telling us that in stone, in labor, in belief, humanity found a way to endure.